The night Philippa Vane decided to humiliate her new sister-in-law at the midsummer ball, she made only one mistake. She did not know what Cecily Marsh had survived to get there. Cecily had arrived at Ashverton House 17 days before the ball, in a hired coach that smelled of wet wool and somebody else's anxiety. She had brought 2 trunks, a leather satchel of her own books, and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to women who have learned that drawing attention to themselves costs more than it is worth. The Duke of Ashverton, Edmund Vane, 34, dark-eyed, with the careful manners of a man who had been burned by carelessness once and intended not to repeat the experience, had met her in the entrance hall. He had bowed. She had curtsied. They had exchanged the exact number of words required by the situation, and not one more. She was not what anyone expected. The arrangement had been made through her late father's solicitor and Edmund's man of business, the kind of transactional correspondence that dealt in practical terms and avoided sentiment entirely. Margaret Cecily Marsh, the solicitor's letter had said, was 26, the eldest daughter of Mr. Henry Marsh, a district magistrate in Shropshire who had died the previous winter and left his household in rather more difficulty than anyone outside it had suspected. She was in good health. She was educated. She was, the letter added in a tone that managed to be both reassuring and faintly apologetic, not likely to cause trouble. What the letter had not mentioned, because the solicitor did not know, and Cecily had given no one reason to inquire, was that she had spent the last 4 years working alongside the physician who had treated her father's tenants. Not as a nurse, precisely. Not as anything with a proper name. She had learned to read a wound, to set a simple fracture, to identify the particular greyish pallor that meant a fever had turned dangerous. She had learned these things because someone had to, because the nearest surgeon was 12 miles away, and the roads in winter were not always passable, and because she had found, to her own surprise, that the sight of a person in pain did not make her look away. It made her want to do something about it. She had not told Edmund any of this. There had been no occasion. They were as yet little more than 2 people sharing a very large house. Philippa Vane had formed her opinion of Cecily within approximately 6 minutes of their first introduction, and she had not revised it since. Philippa was 22, pretty in the way that expects to be noticed, and had occupied the position of undisputed mistress of Ashverton House for 3 years since their mother's death. She had not been consulted about Edmund's marriage. She had not been warned. A letter had arrived from Edmund informing her that he was to be married by special licence to a Miss Marsh of Shropshire, and Philippa had read it twice, very carefully, and then folded it with the precise neatness of someone who is furious and knows better than to show it. She had been perfectly civil to Cecily. That was the thing. Cecily could not have pointed to a single moment of open rudeness. Philippa asked after her comfort. Philippa ensured the household ran smoothly for the arrival of a new mistress. Philippa smiled at dinner with the particular warmth of a woman who has decided to be patient, because she is confident the situation will resolve itself in her favour. What Philippa was waiting for, Cecily understood quite quickly, was evidence. Evidence that this magistrate's daughter was not suited. Evidence that she did not know the correct way to address a dowager countess, or which fork to use at a formal supper, or how to move through the rooms of a ducal estate with the ease that suggested she belonged there. Philippa was collecting small failures, cataloguing them, waiting until she had enough. Cecily knew this because she was observant, and because she had grown up watching her father conduct examinations in their front parlour and had absorbed, without meaning to, a great deal about how people behave when they are building a case. She was careful. She was always careful. She had been careful for most of her adult life. The midsummer ball was Edmund's obligation, an annual event hosted at Ashverton House, attended by the county's significant families and a number of guests from London who came because Edmund's name on an invitation still carried weight. It was the first major occasion since the marriage. It was, Cecily understood, the moment when she would be properly introduced to the world that Edmund inhabited, and the world would form whatever opinion it was going to form. She had a gown made, deep blue silk, cut in the current fashion. It was not the gown she would have chosen entirely for herself, a little more elaborate at the bodice than she preferred, but it was correct. She had her hair dressed by the maid Edmund had engaged for her, a sensible woman named Dorrit, who had opinions about pearl pins and kept them to herself unless asked. She did not wear gloves that concealed her right hand. This was a decision she had made consciously, and it was a decision that would matter later, though she did not know it yet. Her right hand was scarred, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself across a room, but visibly, unmistakably, if one was close enough or inclined to look, a burn from her childhood, a kitchen accident, the kind that happens in a fraction of a second and then stays with you forever. The skin from the base of her thumb to the inside of her wrist was smooth and pale in a way that was different from the rest of her, slightly too tight when she spread her fingers. She had stopped hiding it years ago. It was part of her. She had other concerns. The guests began arriving at 8 o'clock. Edmund appeared at the top of the main stairs at past, and came to stand beside her, which was the correct thing to do, and which he did with every appearance of genuine intention rather than duty. He was better than she had expected, she had found, in the small daily acts of courtesy. He did not ignore her. He did not speak over her. He had a habit of asking her opinion on things and then actually waiting for the answer which she had not anticipated, and which she found, more than anything else, quietly moving. "You look well," he said, and it came out slightly awkward, slightly sincere, the way things do when a person means them, and is not entirely used to saying so. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." He almost smiled. It changed his face considerably. The first hour passed without incident. Cecily moved through the rooms in Edmund's wake, was introduced to more people than she could reliably remember, and said the correct things with the ease of someone who has always been more comfortable with strangers than she appears. The county set were curious and not unkind. The London guests were more openly appraising. She felt their assessments like a light pressure on her skin, not unpleasant, simply present. Philippa drifted near her periodically, all warm smiles and careful positioning. She introduced Cecily to Lady Forrester, with an emphasis on the word Shropshire that was just barely too much. She mentioned twice, in 2 different conversations, that Edmund had married very quickly after a surprisingly short acquaintance. Each time she did it, Cecily noted it and said nothing. It was near the end of the first set of dancing that Lady Hardcastle approached. Lady Hardcastle was 60-something, formidably upright, the widow of a marquess, and possessed of the particular authority that accrues to women who have outlived everyone who ever tried to manage them. She was also, Cecily would later learn, one of Edmund's mother's closest friends, and had an almost proprietary interest in Edmund's well-being that expressed itself as fearsome scrutiny of anyone who might affect it. She looked at Cecily the way a horse trader looks at an animal being presented for sale. Thorough, experienced, not particularly concerned with what the animal thinks about the process. "Your hand," she said after they had spoken for approximately 2 minutes. "Not a question. An observation. A burn," Cecily said. "When I was 8. You don't cover it." "No." Lady Hardcastle considered this for a moment. "Did you think of it?" "I did," Cecily said, "and then I decided not to." Something shifted in Lady Hardcastle's expression. Not warmth, exactly, more like a door opening a crack to let in a draught of air. Enough to tell you there's a different atmosphere on the other side. "Good," said Lady Hardcastle and moved away. It was this conversation that Philippa witnessed from across the room and misread entirely. She had been watching, because Philippa was always watching. She saw Lady Hardcastle's attention drop to Cecily's hand. She saw Cecily's face, which had remained perfectly composed. She saw Lady Hardcastle walk away, and she interpreted what she had seen through the lens of what she wanted to be true. That Lady Hardcastle had noticed something wrong, that there was an opening. What she did not hear was the second part of the conversation, which occurred 20 minutes later, when Lady Hardcastle sought Cecily out again by the windows overlooking the south garden. "Tell me about your father," Lady Hardcastle said. Cecily told her. She told her about the magistrate's house in Shropshire, about the long, cold winters, and the cases her father brought home in his head and worked through at the dinner table, about the way he had never treated her education as an afterthought. She told her about the physician, Dr. Ellicott, and the 4 years she had spent as his unofficial assistant, learning by observation and then by practice what the medical books described in theory. She told it matter-of-factly, without apology or embellishment, because she had never learned to be ashamed of work that was useful. Lady Harcastle listened with the whole of her attention, which was considerable. "You set bones," she said. "Simple fractures. Radius and ulnar, mostly. Ribs. Once a clavicle, which was not simple, but Ellicott had influenza, and there was no one else, and Edmund knows this." "Not in detail," Cecily said honestly. "We haven't had many conversations of that kind yet." Lady Harcastle made a sound that might have been amusement. "You should tell him. I intended to," Cecily said. "When it seemed relevant. It may become relevant sooner than you expect," Lady Harcastle said, and looked at her with an expression that Cecily only understood much later. "This house has needed someone practical for a very long time." The supper was served at 11, and it was at supper that everything happened. They were seated at the long table in the formal dining room. Edmund at the head, Cecily at his right, Philippa several seats down on the same side, which meant that they could not see each other's faces without leaning forward. The table was set for 32. The candelabras were lit. The room smelled of beeswax and the hothouse flowers that had been arranged that afternoon by someone with real skill and no small amount of effort. Cecily was speaking to the gentleman on her right, a retired colonel named Ashworth, who had known her father, and was in probably delightful company when she heard Philippa's voice rise slightly, not loud but shaped to carry, the way voices are when they have been trained from childhood to fill rooms. "Oh, but you must have noticed," Philippa was saying. To the woman across from her, her tone the delicate arch of someone imparting a confidence to exactly as many people as she intends to reach. She wears it so deliberately. In society one one expects a certain effort, doesn't one? Cecily did not turn her head. She continued her conversation with Colonel Ashworth. She had very good peripheral vision, and the practiced stillness of a woman who has held a screaming child still while his arm was reset, and has therefore handled worse than this. Edmund, she saw from the corner of her eye, had gone very quiet. Philippa, emboldened by the silence and the attention of the table, leaned slightly forward to address the woman beside Cecily. Leaned far enough that her voice became general, became a remark to the table rather than a private observation. "It's the sort of thing," she said pleasantly, "that one might expect of someone who wasn't entirely accustomed to. Miss Vane." It was not loud. It did not need to be. Edmund's voice in that register, Cecily would come to know, had a quality like a door shutting very firmly in a quiet house. The table went still. Not completely. Glasses were still being lifted. A footman moved somewhere near the door. But the particular motion of social conversation stopped, and people turned, and Philippa looked at her brother. "You are speaking," Edmund said, "about my wife." Philippa's smile did not falter, which spoke well of her composure and badly of her judgment. "I was only remarking. I heard what you were remarking." He set down his fork, not with force, very carefully, with the deliberate precision of a man containing something that he does not want to become a scene. "I would ask you not to continue." The silence stretched for 3 full seconds, which is a very long time when 31 people are listening. Cecily turned then and looked at Philippa directly for the first time all evening. She had not planned to. It was simply that the moment seemed to require it, to require her presence in it, her face, her composure, her hand resting on the table with the scar visible and perfectly still. What she intended to communicate was nothing in particular. What she communicated, she would later understand, was that she was not afraid. Philippa looked back at her, and for the first time since Cecily had arrived at Ashverton House, Philippa's expression showed something unguarded, not malice and not victory, but a flicker of something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or might have been the thing that precedes it, which is the realization that you have miscalculated. "Of course," Philippa said, and returned to her food. The table resumed. Colonel Ashworth said something gracious about the wine. Someone farther down laughed at something, and the laugh spread, and conversation knit itself back together, the way it does at tables full of well-practiced people who prefer not to remember that anything uncomfortable occurred. But Lady Harcastle, at the far end of the table, caught Cecily's eye and held it for just a moment. She inclined her head very slightly, the way a judge acknowledges a point well made. The ball continued until 2 in the morning. Edmund danced with Cecily twice, which was correct, and then danced with Lady Harcastle once, which was kind, and then spent a half-hour in the corner talking to an elderly peer about drainage, which was apparently necessary. Cecily danced with Colonel Ashworth and two younger gentlemen whose names she retained, and stood at the edge of the floor between sets and watched the room with the particular pleasure of someone who finds people genuinely interesting and is in no hurry. Philippa did not speak to her again that evening. The guests departed. The candles were extinguished room by room. The house settled into its nighttime quiet, that specific deep stillness of large old buildings that absorbs everything that happens in them and keeps it. Cecily was in her dressing room, letting Dorrit take the pins from her hair, when Edmund knocked at the adjoining door. "Come in," she said. He looked tired in the way that events produce. A social tiredness, the depletion of having performed competence in public for 6 hours. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as though checking that his presence was actually welcome, and she thought, he does that, he checks. She had noticed it before and found it again unexpectedly moving. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "For my sister. You don't need to apologize for her," Cecily said. "You addressed it. I should have addressed it earlier." His jaw tightened slightly. "I am aware that she has been. I want you to know that I intend to speak with her. Properly. The way I should have done sooner." Cecily considered this. Dorrit, with admirable discretion, finished with the last pin and made herself absent. "What does that mean?" Cecily asked. "Speaking to her properly. It means that this is your house," Edmund said, "and that if she is unwilling to accept that, then she cannot continue to live in it." He said it evenly. It was clearly something he had been sitting with all evening, the decision that had formed itself quietly while he was discussing drainage and dancing with dowagers. "She is your sister," Cecily said. "Yes." He looked at her directly. "And you are my wife, which means—" He stopped, tried again with less formality and more honesty. "Which should mean that you are not made to feel in your own home that you are on trial for a crime you have not committed." The room was very quiet. The fire had burned down to embers and the light was soft and uncertain, which was perhaps why it felt easier than it might have otherwise to say true things. "I worked as a physician's assistant," Cecily said, "for 4 years, setting bones and treating fevers and delivering infants in farmhouses when the weather was too bad for the proper midwife to reach them. I should have told you, I intended to, but I was waiting to understand. I wanted to know who you were first." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face that she could not quite read. Not surprise, exactly. More like the look of a man who has been carrying a question and has just been offered an answer from an unexpected direction. "And do you," he said, "know who I am?" "Somewhat," she said. "I think you are rather better than you have led me to expect." He almost laughed. It was nearly the same almost smile as before, but warmer, closer to the surface. "That is a very moderate commendation. It's an honest one," she said. "I don't do otherwise." He stood there for another moment, and then he said quietly, "I don't either," and she believed him. 3 weeks later, Philippa moved to the Vane family's property in Derbyshire, accompanied by a companion her brother had arranged, and a settlement that was more than generous and somewhat less than she had anticipated as her permanent expectation. Edmund handled it without drama and without cruelty, which Cecily observed and noted. He was direct with his sister, clear about what was required, and he did not use more force than the situation needed. Philippa went. She wrote a letter 2 months after that was formal and not warm, but was genuinely without venom. Cecily read it and thought, she is not entirely without understanding. She will need time. She filed the letter in her writing desk and turned back to her mourning. The house had begun to change shape around her, in the way that houses do when a person stops moving carefully through them and starts simply living. She had taken over the still room and reorganized it with Dr. Ellicott's principles in mind, which alarmed the housekeeper initially and reassured her within a fortnight. She had established a habit of visiting the tenant farms every week, which raised eyebrows, and then gradually did not. She had delivered 2 infants in a cottage on the south edge of the estate, both straightforward, both healthy, and the news of this had moved through the district, in the quiet, self-organizing way of information that people find important. Edmund joined her once, on a Tuesday in early autumn, when she went to check on a farmhand who had broken 2 fingers and was not healing as quickly as he should. She had not asked him to come. He had said at breakfast that he thought he would accompany her. She had looked at him and said, "You should wear older boots," and he had changed his boots and come. He was not useful in the medical sense. He was quite useful in the sense of knowing the farmhand's name and his family's history, and the particular way that people in that district responded to a duke who remembered their children's names. He held the lamp when she examined the fingers. He did not look away. On the walk back, along the field path with the evening light lying flat and golden across the stubble, he said, "You are remarkable, you know." She thought about deflecting this. It was the easier thing. "I am competent," she said instead, which is rarer than remarkable and more useful. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Both," he said. "You are both." She did not answer because the path had narrowed and she was watching where she stepped, but she was aware, precisely and fully, that something had shifted between them. Not suddenly, not in a single moment, but in the accumulating way of things that have been growing in the ordinary light of daily life, without announcing themselves. The letter from Lady Harcastle arrived the following week. It was addressed to Cecily alone, and contained several pages of confident opinion on the management of large households, a digression about the proper cultivation of physic gardens, and one paragraph near the end that said, without preamble, "I believe Edmund has finally had the good sense to stop looking for his late mother in every woman he meets, and to see what is actually in front of him. I credit you. I hope you will not disabuse me of this impression." Cecily read this paragraph twice, and then once more. She wrote back the next afternoon, "I credit neither of us with more strategy than the situation deserved. But I am glad, and I will try not to give you reason to revise your opinion." She sent the letter before she could second-guess the warmth of it. That evening at dinner, Edmund poured the wine himself, because the footman had stepped out for something, and he poured hers first, which was correct, and then his own, and then he looked across the table at her and said, quite simply, "I hope you know that I am glad you're here." Outside the windows of the dining room, the early dark of October was settling over the estate, over the tenant farms and the field paths and the still room with its reorganized shelves. The candles were lit. The fire was good. "I know," Cecily said, and then, because she had decided some time ago that she would try to be honest in the specific ways that mattered, "I am glad, too." It was not a declaration of anything so tidy as love, not yet, but it was the kind of true thing that does not unsay itself, that stays in a room after the words have stopped, that becomes part of what two people know about each other. It was, in the way of real things, enough for now, and the beginning of more than enough for everything that came after.